If you have no idea who I am, my name's Kyle, one of the pastors here at our church, also one of the co-directors of Veritas. I was out last week, but I'm back. It's great to be with you. Good to see lots of faces, lots of new faces. Like Nick said, if we've not met, please come introduce yourself. I would love to get to know you a little bit later. I was hanging out with my daughters the other day, and we were listening to some T Swift, as a good father does, and as I was listening, it reminded me of a few years ago when I watched her documentary on Netflix. Maybe you've seen it, Miss Americana. To be honest, I have no idea why I watched it, because I watched it by myself in kind of a dark room, but I enjoyed it. And I enjoyed it for a lot of reasons, but one of which is that I thought that it did a fairly good job. At least it seemed like it. You never really know. But it seemed like it did a fairly decent job at kind of giving us an insight into what the life of one of the biggest celebrities, arguably, if not the biggest, one of the biggest celebrities in the world, give us some insight into what her life is like, which admittedly is a life that most of us can only imagine through watching something like a documentary, yeah? But here's the thing. The more that I watched this documentary of Taylor Swift, and this is going to sound a little bit crazy, but I think it's true. The more that I realized, or the more that I watched, the more I realized that, you know what, Taylor Swift's life, Taylor Swift is a lot like you and me. Now, of course, we've got to strip away all the glamour, all the fame, all the money, all the celebrity. You've got to strip away all of that. But when you do, what you're left with is you're left with a human being looking for something to make her happy. You're left with a human being created in the image of God, looking for something or someone to validate her. You're looking at a human being who is looking for something to give her meaning and purpose and significance, a sense of belonging in the world. And I say that she's a lot like us because I think that's true of you and I too, right? Like, we want something that will make us happy. We want to look to something or to have something or to someone that will validate us. We're looking for a sense of meaning and purpose and belonging. If you haven't seen the documentary, one of the things that she says, it stuck with me. She says this. She said, my life had never been better. I'd won Album of the Year at the Grammys for a second time, which I never thought was a possibility. And I remember thinking at the time, oh my gosh, that was all you ever wanted. That was all you focused on. And then she goes on, she says, you get to the mountaintop and you look around and you're like, oh God, what now? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Like all she ever wanted was to get to the top of the mountain, and when she did, it wasn't enough. It's kind of a story that we're familiar with, right? Like, we just want to get to the top. Whatever the top is, we want to get to the top, and then, we've heard the story. You get to the top, you realize, actually being at the top, what now? See, what Taylor Swift thought that she wanted wasn't what she really wanted at all. And in our passage tonight, I think that God is going to teach us that the same thing is true of you and me, that what we think we want isn't what we really want at all. And so that begs the question, then if that's true, then, okay, Kyle, what do we really want? Well, I think that's the question. I think it's, more importantly, I think it's the answer that we get from an encounter that Jesus has with a man in John chapter 5, of all places, at a pool in the first century. So let's pick it up. John chapter 5, verse 1 says this. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda. It's surrounded by five covered colonnades. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. Now, it's interesting, or at least it's interesting to me. Maybe it's a little bit nerdy, to be honest, but it's interesting that all sorts of scholars, and just as an aside for a second, all sorts of historians and scholars, the 18th, 19th century, they take these verses, these exact verses, John 5, 1 through 3, and they say, look, we got you. We got you Bible people. We got you Christians, because here's the deal. They said these verses are proof that we can't trust the reliability of the Bible.
We can't trust the reliability of the Bible because they said that there was no historical evidence, there was no physical evidence whatsoever of this pool that John describes here in chapter 5. And if there's no physical evidence, if there's no pool, then what's happening is John's just making up some detail in a story. And if he's making it up, why on earth would we believe it? Which is a legitimate argument, right? Like if John is making stuff up, then yeah, maybe we shouldn't trust it. It's true, but there's a problem. There's a problem for those historians and those scholars and those archaeologists, and that's because they actually found the pool. You can go and see it. Here's a picture of it. I've actually been here. This is in Israel, in Jerusalem, several years ago. This is one of those things like you don't really know what you're looking at, but basically at the bottom of that pit, kind of in the middle, is this exact pool. It's kind of the southern part of this pool that John is mentioning. What's happened is that over time, things have decayed, crumbled, things were built on top of it, and so it took years and years and years, obviously hundreds of years, for archaeologists, oh gosh, words are hard. It's been like a month since I've been up. Archaeologists, words are hard. They found it, right? That's the point. They found it. But it was because stuff had been built on top of it that it took so long. Why am I telling you this? You can take that down. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this, and I'm pausing here to point out, because I think sometimes what happens when we read the Bible, we pass over things, little details, like, hey, there is this gate called the Sheep Gate in this city called Jerusalem, and near this Sheep Gate in this city called Jerusalem, kind of around the temple, is this pool, and we're a little bit like, why does it matter? The reason that I'm bringing it up is because what I want us to see is that this is not some myth. This is not some legend. These are real people, real places, real history that is verifiable, that is found. You can go and see it. And so what that means, the only reason I'm bringing this up is because what it means is that actually it's building a case that we can trust the Bible. Unlike other things that it's not just made up. We can trust it. We can trust John's eyewitness testimony. And this testimony, he tells us, as he continues in this chapter, he tells us that around this particular pool, he said, are all sorts of people, the lame, the blind, the paralyzed. And he says, in particular, verse 5, he says, one guy was there who'd been there, he'd been disabled for 38 years. So Jesus says, or John says rather, there's a guy that's been at this pool. He's been disabled for 38 years. Presumably in the first century, this is presumably this dude's entire life. He's been disabled. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. Imagine what life must have been like for that guy. Imagine what it must have been like for him. How physically exhausting life must have been. How emotionally taxing it must have been. The frustration of not being able to do things for himself. He's just laying around a pool for years and years and years. His entire life. What do you think that guy wanted? What do you think, if you put yourself in his shoes for a second, what do you think he wanted? This is what Jesus says when he sees him in verse 6. It says, when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he'd been in this condition for a long time, he asked a question. He says, do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? Now, I want you to notice something. If you're familiar with the New Testament, if you've maybe read the Gospels and are familiar with the stories in the Gospels, I want us to pay attention for a second. If not, that's totally fine. But know this, that this encounter that Jesus has with this man is different than other healing type stories that we read in the Bible. See, because often when people want something of Jesus, from Jesus, what do? They go to him, right? So just some examples. Think about the time that some friends break through a roof and they lower a paralyzed buddy down to the floor so that they can just get the guy in front of Jesus so Jesus can heal him. Or maybe the time that a mother pleads with Jesus to heal her sick daughter. Or the time there's a city official, he's desperate to get to Jesus. He's frantically chasing after Jesus. Why? Because his son is dying and he knows that Jesus can make him well. Or think about the time that the woman, she risked public shame, public embarrassment. She breaks through a crowd even though it says she's unclean just so that she can touch Jesus' robe. See, often when people want something from Jesus, they go to him. But what does this guy do? He doesn't do anything, does he? He doesn't go to Jesus at all. In fact, verse 13, it says that he didn't even know who Jesus was. So think about that for a second. Here's a guy who, he's been disabled. We don't totally know to what extent, to what capacity. But presumably, he's been disabled his entire life. He can't fix himself. He's not gotten his life straightened out. He's laying around a pool. He didn't ask Jesus to heal him. He doesn't reach out to Jesus whatsoever. And yet, what does Jesus do? Jesus reaches out to him and asks maybe the most important question anybody has ever asked this man. He says, do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? Now, maybe you're here tonight and you see a little bit of yourself in that guy. And what I mean by that is you're not really looking for Jesus either, to be honest. Like, that's not why you're here. Maybe you don't even know why you're here. Maybe you tagged along, friend brought you last minute, just said, hey, please come, it's, whatever. And you're a little bit like, why am I inside of a church? Why am I at this Jesus thing? And what am I doing here? Maybe you don't really know why you're here. You don't think you want Jesus, but I want you to hear me. If you're here, I want you to hear me say this. Jesus wants you. He wants a relationship with you. It's not just a coincidence that you're here. Jesus brought you here because he wants a relationship with you, whether you know that or not. Or maybe you're here tonight and you're like, yeah, no, here's the deal. I really do want Jesus. But you're kind of telling yourself that for far too long, you've been telling yourself, you just got to clean yourself up. You got to fix yourself because you're too messy, too broken, too complicated, too sinful, man, if Jesus only knew. So you got to get yourself cleaned up and then you can come to Jesus. But it's been how many years? And metaphorically speaking, you're just kind of lying around a pool, spiritually paralyzed. But Jesus is asking you too. He's asking all of us one way or another. He's saying, do you want to get well? Look at how this guy answers this question. This is the next verse, verse 7. Sir, that's what he calls Jesus, this disabled man replied. He says, I have no one to help me into the pool. So Jesus asked him, hey, do you want to get well? And the guy goes, hey, look, I don't have anyone to help me get into the pool when the water's stirred. Every time I'm trying to get in, while I'm trying to get in, man, everyone beats me too. Someone else goes down ahead of me. What on earth is this guy talking about? It's kind of a weird response, right? Jesus says to him, he says, hey, do you want to get well? And the guy's like, yeah, I do. Could you maybe help me get down into the pool? I'd love to go for a swim. What's he talking about? There's some kind of historical context going on here. In the first century, there's a myth about this particular pool. And this myth was related to the fact that for some reason, periodically, the waters of this particular pool would get disturbed or stirred. And there's a lot of different opinions about what's actually stirring the water. Remember, I say it's a myth. Some actually believe that it was like a spiritual thing, like there are angels stirring the pool. Kind of weird, I know, but that was the myth. And even more, the idea was that when the water was stirred, that there were healing powers that were brought to the water. And even more, if you were the first person into the pool after the water was stirred and these healing powers were brought to the water, then you would be healed. All your problems would go away. And so you get kind of why so many people, it kind of maybe makes sense all of a sudden of why all these people are laying around this pool, because they want to be healed, right? They want to be healed, and this is their shot. And this guy that we're talking to, the reason he responds to Jesus the way he does is because he can't get in. He doesn't have anyone to help him get down into the water. Again, think about that. 38 years. He doesn't have anybody to help him get in. He's got to be tremendously alone. tremendously isolated, desperate for change. He just wants someone to help him get into the water so that all of his problems can go away. And maybe you connect with that. Maybe you know what it is to be tremendously isolated and alone. And if someone could just help me get in the water. You see, but what he thinks he wants, it's not what he really wants. Jesus knew what he really wanted. Jesus knew what he really needed. He didn't need a cultural myth. He didn't need some magic pool to make him well. No, what he needed was Jesus. Next couple verses. After he says to Jesus, look, I don't have anyone to help me get into the water. This is what Jesus says to him. Verse 8, Jesus says, get up, take your bed, walk. And at once, the man is healed. And he took up his bed and he walked. I mean, isn't that incredible? With the power of his word, Jesus speaks, and something that hasn't been able to happen for the last 38 years, this thing that's been impossible, this thing that's been unthinkable, he says, get up, and the dude just gets up, and he walks. See, for the past 38 years, what this man thought that he needed most, he thought that what he really wanted, what he wanted most, what he needed most was to get down into that pool. But what he really wanted, he thought he wanted water in a pool. But what he really wanted, what he really needed was Jesus. He just didn't know it. See, what we think we want, it's not what we really want. And so here's a question. What is it that you think you want? I don't know your story. I don't know what brought you here tonight. I don't know why you're here. I'm glad you are. I don't know exactly, though, why you're here. But what is it that you think you want? What is that thing that, man, if I could just have that, if I could just get down into that pool, man, all my problems would go away. Everything would be better about my life. What is it? Is it if I just had more friends? If I just had less anxiety? Maybe you finally get that if I could just get that boyfriend or that girlfriend that, man, I just want a relationship so bad. If I could just have that. If I had more money, if I could have sex, if I could have alcohol, if I could have more accomplishments. Maybe some stability or how about comfort? Maybe peace. Maybe it's a cure. See, what is it that you think you want? Here's a deeper, harder question. What's underneath that? What is it that you really want? See, it's kind of like asking, do you want Jesus or do you want magic water? Do you want Jesus or do you want some cultural myth? See, I think sometimes, just to go off for a second, I think sometimes we actually know the right answer. We say, yeah, no, I want Jesus. Like, when you put it like that, of course, who's going to say, no, I want that? I want Jesus. But I think sometimes we say Jesus because we know it's the right answer, but we don't really want Jesus. What we want is what Jesus can get us. We want Jesus to be the one to carry us into the water, right? So I want you, Jesus, yeah, but I want you to help my grades get better. I want you, Jesus, but help me get that internship. I want you, Jesus, but please make all my problems. I want you, Jesus, insofar as you help me sleep at night. I want you, Jesus, insofar as my life is comfortable and happy all the time. If you could just make all my problems go away, Jesus, my life would be so much better. And of course, that begs the question, do we want Jesus or do we just want the things that Jesus can, that we think that Jesus can get us? I don't know what your answer is. I think if I'm honest, there are all sorts of times in my life where, yeah, I say I'm a pastor. I've been working here for 17, it's like, yeah, I want Jesus, but I think a lot of times I want so many other things. Do I really want Jesus? Or am I just saying the right answer? See, I think what we think we want, it's not what we really want. Jesus knows, though. It's the beauty of this passage. Jesus knows what we really want. Why? Why can I say that? Because Jesus created you with that want. Jesus created you with that desire. Jesus created you to want him most. See, what you really want, whether you know it or not, what you really want is him. Because you see, that thing that we think we want, it's not gonna really bring lasting happiness. Of course, those things that I mentioned earlier, of course they make us happy, and sometimes they make life better, and sometimes it really does feel like, hey, this is the solution to all my problems. But that happiness it's only temporary. It's not really going to make us well in the sense that we want and need to be made well. And I think the same thing is true for the guy in this chapter, because look at what happens a few verses later. It says that in verse 14, it says, later, Jesus found this guy in the temple, and he says to him, see, you're well again. But then pay attention to this. He says, stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you. And Jesus is kind of intense right here, yeah? Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you. See, for 38 years, this man thought that the worst thing that could happen to him, his biggest problem, was that he had a disability that made him socially outcast and alone. But what Jesus is saying to him here is that he had a bigger problem. That physical healing isn't what he needed most. That this bigger problem, it was a far greater sickness. It was a far deeper sickness. It was a spiritual sickness that he couldn't see. Maybe you've heard this story before. About 100 years ago, there were some editors that got together. This is over in the UK. They got together, newspaper editors, and they posed a question to some of the greatest thinkers of the day, writers of the day, and they posed this question: what's wrong with the world? What's wrong with the world? And they invited people, these thinkers, authors, writers, etc., to weigh in on this, and so that they could publish all these different responses. And as you can imagine, they range from, poverty to lack of education, sickness, war, injustice, these kinds of things, legitimate challenges, legitimate terrible things in the world. But one of the more interesting things the newspaper found, they published one particular response. And they said of all the responses, this was the most interesting thing to them. It was a response from a Christian. And it was just a couple words. And in response to that question, what's wrong with the world? This Christian writes in and he says 4 words: dear sirs, I am. What's wrong with the world? Dear sirs, it's me. Not because he was a bad guy, but because he knew he was sick. He knew that he was sinful. He knew that he was broken. See, that question that Jesus is asking that man, and that question that Jesus is asking us, do you want to get well? It only makes sense if we're sick. What Jesus is saying to all of us tonight is that every single one of us is sick, whether we know it or not, that we have a spiritual sickness that leads to something far worse than an unhappy relationship, far worse than a medical diagnosis, far worse than being left out or being betrayed by a friend, far worse than losing our status in an organization, far worse than the sleepless nights of anxiety. Of course, those are real problems. I'm not trying to minimize those things and negate the fact that those are real significant issues. But what Jesus is trying to help us see is that they're nothing in comparison to the damage that sin does in our lives. And not just our lives, but in the lives of people around us. It's one of these hard, uncomfortable things about the Bible that it teaches us. It teaches us that this is what sin does. It always destroys. It always wreaks havoc. It always damages. It always distorts and deceives and brings destruction in our lives, which is precisely why Jesus is not just interested in our physical healing. Of course, he wants to heal us, and if not in this life, when he returns, one day all things will be made right. No sickness, no sorrow, no death. All of that will go away, no sin. But what Jesus wants to cure us of is this spiritual sickness. And that's what we really want. That spiritual sickness that we all have, whether we know it or not, that's what we really want. We want Jesus to heal us from that. See, what I want to say is that these cultural myths that we're tempted to buy into, they don't heal, they don't bring lasting happiness, they make promises that they can't keep. And most of them, they actually, if we're honest, they just make our lives worse after a while. We find ourselves year after year lying by a pool, this magic water, and the whole time we're kind of just spiritually paralyzed. And if you're in that place right now, where you've just kind of been laying by this metaphorical pool, paralyzed, isn't that exhausting? I mean, I've been there, so I ask because I know what it feels like. It's grueling, isn't it? It's lonely. Jesus is offering something more. Jesus is offering you some more, me something more. He's offering healing. He's offering you a cure. And I say that because what Jesus is offering you is himself. See, what you think you want, it's not what you really want. What you really want is Jesus. Maybe you're following with me and you're like, okay, yeah, that's where I'm at. I've been chasing this other thing for so long, and maybe what I'm saying is connecting with you, and you're like, yeah, okay, maybe I do want Jesus. But you're like me, or if you're like me, sometimes there's a gap between what we know and what we do, right? So like for me, like I know I shouldn't eat junk food, but it tastes so good, so I eat it anyway, yeah? Like I know it's terrible. I know it's rotting my body. I know that I shouldn't get Taco Bell at 12 a.m. How can you not? There's a gap between what I know and what I don't really get Taco Bell at midnight, but sorry if you do. In fact, I know a lot of you do. There's a gap. There's a gap between what I know and what I do, right? To eat healthier, what do we have to do? We have to create new habits. We have to work at creating new habits so that we actually want healthier food. We don't just say, okay, I want it. No, we have to create habits that change our tastes, our wants. And so what I want to say is that cultural myths, they're tempting, right? They're just like that junk food. They taste good. You think you want them, and then you start eating them for a long time. You realize it's not doing anything but making your life worse, making you spiritually unhealthy. We think we want sugar. We think we want pop culture. We think we want this. We think we want that. But what we really want is our Creator. What we really want is living water. What we really want is the bread of life. What we really want is Jesus. So Jesus asked that man, and I think 2,000 years later, he's asking every single one of us in this room tonight, do you want to get well? Do you? Think about that. Do you want to get well? Do you see yourself as spiritually sick? Do you want to get well? If the answer to that is yes, if you want to get up and walk at the sound of Jesus inviting you to himself in your life, then here's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to develop new habits. You're going to have to develop new tastes for Jesus. You're going to have to put some work into it. It's not just going to come easy. Following Jesus is not easy. If anyone tells you it's easy, they're lying to you. It's hard. If you've been following Jesus very long at all, you know following Jesus is hard. So how do we develop new habits? How do we develop new tastes? It's kind of weird to say that, but how do we develop new tastes for Jesus? A lot of things that I could say, but I was thinking about it. I was like, what if we just start small? And by small, I mean really small. What if you did this? What if you memorized a Bible verse? In fact, this Bible verse, John 6:35, it says this. This is Jesus talking. And he says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Maybe you grabbed one of those journals when you walked in this week, or maybe you got one last week and you brought it back. Maybe just write that verse down, or if you can't get the whole thing, just write John 6:35 down and go back to it. But what if you memorized that verse? It's going to sound really simple, maybe silly, but what if you did this? What if you, for this next week, just try this? What if for the next week, every time you ate or drank something, you said that verse in your head? You remind yourself that Jesus says to you that he is the bread of life, that whoever comes to him will never be hungry, will never be thirsty. What if every time you just kind of catch yourself daydreaming this week, or every time you catch yourself longing for that cultural myth or that pop culture or that sugar, whatever that thing is, what if you just recite that verse to yourself? You start to change your habits, you start to change your diet, you start to change your tastes, you start to change your wants. So that you don't want this. What you really want is Jesus. I don't know. I wonder what kind of difference that would make in your life. What if you just tried it? Just try it. I wonder what kind of difference it would make in a community of a couple hundred college students living in Columbia or wherever you're living this summer. I wonder what difference it would make in the lives of people around you if you were the kind of people, if we were the kind of people that increasingly stop chasing cultural myths, pop culture, because what we really want is Jesus. See, Jesus is asking you tonight, he's saying, do you want to get well? Do you want to hear his voice in your life? That's what he's asking. And this is what he's saying. He's saying, get up. Get up and walk. Get up and follow me. Turn from that magic water and turn to me, because I'm where life is found. Let's pray. Oh, Jesus, just forgive us. Forgive me. The ways that I so often think that what I really want is just some magic water in a pool. When you're offering me the bread of life, the living water, yourself. Oh God, would you change my habits? Would you change my desires? Would you change my wants? Would you change our wants so that we would increasingly want you and nothing else? Oh God, we need you to do that. We can't change ourselves. Spirit, we need you to bring that transformation to our lives. Would you do that? It's in your name we pray.